One of the interesting things that I noticed during my most recent playthrough of Fire Emblem Path of Radiance is that there are no thrones. If you've played Fire Emblem in nearly any capacity, you'll be familiar with the infamous terrain tiles that give you various bonuses while you stand on them. Terrain bonuses are ancient in Fire Emblem, and they go back as far as FE1. So when Path of Radiance came along and just deleted almost all of them, you can bet that this came as a shock to the system. Also, if you're interested in seeing said run we've been doing, check the description for a full playlist. It's super fun, and I've been making videos on it every week. Anyways, naturally, like any other Fire Emblem nerd who notices a certain mechanic, I decided to dive into the internet and take a look at what terrain bonuses have been like historically and how they've changed, and then sit here and scratch my head as to why they've removed them. So let's take a trip down memory lane and explore the history of terrain in Fire Emblem. The NES era of Fire Emblem was a simpler time. I mean, literally, just look at the games and how they play. But that doesn't mean that these mechanics didn't have their roots implanted from such a young age in our franchise's history. At this point in the series, though, these terrain bonuses were still primitive, yet they set the foundations for decades to come. On the one hand, they increased avoid and impeded the movement cost of most units going through them, and on the other, you had your healing terrain such as forts and castles. Forts healed a static 5 HP, and castles were a range of 3 to 10. Gaiden, however, got rid of that and introduced recovery and swamp terrain. One which recovered 5 HP, basically like it's called, and the other which made your units take 5 damage each turn in addition to drastically slowing down movement. This would be the first place that damage-based tiles would be seen. Mystery of the Emblem was an SNES game, but I'm gonna tack it on here because it was nearly identical to the first game in terms of terrain. But instead of having a range of healing from thrones and castles, you just got a static 10 HP here. With the following transition of Fire Emblem to the SNES, however, we got a big upgrade when it came to FE4, both graphically but also in terms of gameplay. Trust me when I say I could spend hours gushing about the mechanic upgrades and innovation put into FE4, believe me, but since we're talking about terrain bonuses, let's hone in on the specifics. And our big upgrade here, drumroll please, also know that I'm being sarcastic by the way, is that now our terrain has the capability of healing us, fully in the form of churches. I don't think that actually ever came back in Fire Emblem, but it really is an interesting thought, especially given the sheer size of the maps. Being positioned inside of a castle was also the first time in Fire Emblem where they changed the healing bonus to be percentage-based, as it's now 20% of max HP minus 1. One also underappreciated and maybe less well-known fact is that this game also introduced movement boosting terrain in the general roads that are between castles. These decrease your movement cost by 0.7 per tile, which basically boosts your movement by about 40%. The rich end up getting richer, and that makes Cavalry king here, but all units do benefit, so bring your dancer along and go off to the races. And last but not least, this game was also the first to introduce negative bonuses to terrain. You know those roads that boosted your movement earlier? Well, stand on them at your own risk because you're gonna lose 10 avoid for it. Ooh, spooky. As much as I'd like to group the SNE games together though, Thracia 776 came along just a year later and shook up the formula once again. Those broken movement boosts are now gone, and in their place comes a brand new, never before seen defense boost on certain tiles. Thrones, pillars, and forts all come into play here, and not only do they heal you now, this starts to shape quite the variety of terrain for us going forward that our units can use to protect themselves with the added defense, while also adding to our map design choices that we can see. With new additions like this though, it was heavily imbalanced and made any bosses that were on a throne or a gate super tanky and very hard to kill. I mean, in a game where all stats are capped at 20, having a boss get a flat additional 10 defense is pretty cracked. And yes, that's exactly what they got in Thracia. Also one of the more controversial things, but Thracia also brought with it effect tiles that, while not specifically terrain, extend effects while you stood on them, like the infamous teleportation tiles in Chapter 24X. This continued into the GBA era with Binding Blade, which took inspiration from Thracia. While this era dumbed down a lot of the mechanics and innovation of Fire Emblem in favor of simplicity and core gameplay focus, terrain was more prominent and started to become more of a focus to your strategy as a player and also how enemies operate. Binding Blade sees the same level of overpowered bonuses that Thracia did, but once the game's transitioned to release in the West with the advent of Blazing Blade and Sacred Stones, these bonuses were turned down quite a bit to make enemies still harder to beat, but far easier than they were in the former two games. Thrones, for example, were nerfed from 30 avoid and 3 defense to 20 and 2, which is a 33% decrease in effectivity, and while that might not seem like a lot, if you play both games, you'll actually feel the difference. Damage tiles continue to be a thing here, such as the fire tiles, while taking it further with areas that can poison you as well. And then, the moment you've all been waiting for, as if none of the evolution of terrain was important up until now, we instantly go into the Tellius era on the GameCube and Wii, where they completely remove most terrain and just toss in the trash the last 15 years of terrain development. And that's what kinda shocked me. Gone are the seas maps with big bosses on the throne. Gone are the forts where I can park my generals to become tanking machines, and gone are the pillars in the hallways that my infantry units would use to dodge tank on enemy phase. Instead, they added healing bushes? I don't know how that makes sense. Does Ike just stand on a healing bush and eat some kind of blueberry that restores 10% of his HP? Actually, maybe that is how it works and the thrones just don't have blueberries on them and that's why they removed them? Maybe this game was so anti-racism and slavery that it wanted to remove thrones altogether to send a message that we're anti-abusive monarchy or something. Actually, wait, that doesn't make sense either because Alencia becomes queen at the end, so yeah, but I digress. I thought it was a very interesting choice here to remove most of the terrain bonuses that they'd spent the best part of the last 4 games refining and getting us used to. Normally, I'd think of games as a linear trajectory that would build and enhance what's already available instead of stripping it away and defaulting back to basically just bushes or nothing else. I mean, this is more simple than Shadow Dragon Fire Emblem 1 was in its beginning. Most of the boss and defense tiles are just blue or yellow color and they give 10% healing and that's it. Radiant Dawn, on the other hand, actually tried to do something interesting here though and introduced the concept of altitude. This has always been a thing in series like Final Fantasy Tactics, where having the high ground was always advantageous, so much so that Obi-Wan would be very happy and pleased. But Fire Emblem only ever did it in Radiant Dawn. I honestly wonder why. I don't really think this was a terrible idea. After that, enter the DS era, which really only had 2 games, both of which were remakes of FE1 and 3, or the Marth games. All the initial terrain was brought back, but we now have defense boosts added onto them. The continued movement cost was still factored into them, keeping it consistent with the very first generation to ever do it. And it was nice to have it back, but really puzzling as to why it would be gone in the Tellius games in the first place. The 3DS brought with it further progression in the terrain meta, almost as if to take us back to the glory days of the GBA once again. Just like we had primitive beginnings with the NES, improvement into the SNES, and lots of innovation with the GBA, the jump from Tellius to DS to 3DS era seems to be similar, almost as if the teams were mimicking the prior success of their predecessors. In Fire Emblem Awakening, we see it in small bits. It's almost like a back to the basics kind of deal, similar to the GBA games. We have our iconic forest tiles, but also the return of forts, gates, and thrones in addition to the hazard tiles that damage you. There's nothing crazy unique, but it's a familiar blast from the past that is safe to use. This game was their last Hail Mary at keeping the series alive, and I guess they wanted to bring back all the mechanics from previous games without going too crazy. But riding on the coattails of the success of Awakening came Fates, and oh boy did it try to innovate, if not maybe go a little bit too far. Fates took a page out of Thracia's book and then decided to tell it to hold its beer. It has so many different types of terrain and terrain effects it won't even fit on one page. What used to be a simplistic formula of avoid and movement cost turned into defense boosting, and now has an entire map design application going from that to moving you around to changing the entire way maps look. We now have 2 different efficacy healing tiles, we have the classic forts, gates, and thrones, we have freaking ledges, and we have dragon veins that not only give you terrain bonus, but also let you completely reshape the map with your godlike powers. There is also a wide array of penalties added to terrain like desert, waste, fissure, water, and tempest tiles, all exerting a negative avoid bonus to the units standing on them. And then the king of them all is the Caltrops space, which exerts huge debuffs to the units standing on them, but can also be disarmed by the lock touch skill. Some people will say that this was overwhelming on a whole, but with the amount of tools at your disposal, the amount of varying terrain here actually feels good and fair. And I feel like it's one of the reasons that Conquest is able to have robust map design, because the terrain can also play a decent role in modifying that map design to be more formidable and tight while adding a variable to gameplay that we never really saw properly leveraged before. Echo's Shadows of Valentia, of course, came towards the end of the 3DS lifecycle, and being a remake, I feel like it really doesn't count much in this conversation. But for the sake of completion, I'll mention it here and say that it basically just carried forward what its original game did and didn't really expand on the terrain whatsoever. It very much stayed a faithful remake, and I'm okay with that. Last but not least, we enter the Switch era, which, while not as ambitious as Fates, seems to have at the very least kept terrain consistent with what it was like in the GBA games and Awakening. Three Houses is the most popular game in the franchise, and yet it's not the most ambitious one when it comes to map design. Its terrain game is honestly more expansive than you'd initially think it was playing the game, and that's probably because it's not utilized very well. But it is in there. We still have the avoid and defensive ones like forests, forts, and thrones, as well as the negative bonus ones like sand and craters. But we also have healing tiles and damage tiles as well, all of which have varying forms. To my knowledge, Three Houses is also the first Fire Emblem game to feature negative defense bonuses with terrain as well. The utilization of them is suspect, however, and they feel a lot more optional when compared to Fates. Engage came in and made terrain more front and center with the inclusion of brand new miasma tiles. These are tiles that debuff your units while buffing the enemy units, which is an interesting twist that we've never before seen in Fire Emblem. They can also be dispelled through Emblem Core and Skill, giving you the ability to manipulate terrain yourself in this game to create walls and barriers and even fog with which to protect your units. Another new mechanic to Fire Emblem that I actually like very much and am in support of. One of my favorite SRPGs, Triangle Strategy, has a lot of very interesting interactions with terrain that I could probably make a whole video praising. But if Fire Emblem were to take some inspiration from that for our future games, I would be very happy. But who knows what the future brings with Fortune's Weave? It seems like we're returning to Fodlan, so I'd imagine that we're probably going to see more of the same as what we got in Three Houses, though I'd love to be optimistic and hope that we can get something more interesting that is at least in line with Engage or maybe increased ambition like in Fates. But that's all I've got for this video for now. Just a fun little one that I had the inspiration to make and to fill up your Friday since I don't have an upload of our stream series for. So definitely feel free to let me know what you think in the comments below, and don't miss our Path of Radiance series that we've been doing. Link in the description of the full playlist below. And that's all from me for now. I'll see you all in another video very soon. Peace.